At 11:47 a.m., just 3 miles from Area 51, two police officers handcuffed a black man in a blue denim shirt beside a lonely stretch of Nevada highway. The desert sun burned brightly overhead, turning the pale sand and distant mountains almost white beneath the cloudless sky. Patrol lights flashed against the harsh daylight as Officer Wade Mercer stood directly in front of the man, his expression hard and suspicious. The man's name was Calvin Morgan. To Mercer and his partner, Officer Blake Turner, he was simply another suspicious driver who had no business being this close to a restricted area. They had no idea that the quiet man standing between their patrol vehicles was carrying documents so sensitive that only a handful of people in the country were authorized to know they existed. And they certainly had no idea who had authorized Calvin to carry them. "Put your hands behind your back," Mercer ordered. Calvin slowly turned toward him. "Officer, I've already shown you my identification." His voice remained calm, almost unnaturally calm. Mercer smirked. "I told you to put your hands behind your back." Turner stood beside the patrol vehicle, watching carefully. His eyes moved from Calvin's face to the black briefcase resting on the passenger seat of the SUV. Blue denim shirt, dark trousers, no visibility, no government convoy, no bodyguards. Nothing about Calvin looked powerful. And that was exactly what Mercer saw. "You people always think you can talk your way out of everything," Mercer muttered. Calvin's expression barely changed, but something hardened behind his eyes. He knew that tone. He knew what happened when someone decided who you were before bothering to learn your name. He could have ended the confrontation with a single sentence. He could have told them exactly who he was, but he didn't. Instead, he looked toward the distant security perimeter and quietly said, "You should call your supervisor." Mercer laughed. "I don't need a supervisor to do my job." The handcuffs clicked shut. Sunlight glinted off the metal around Calvin's wrists. For several seconds, nobody spoke. The only sound were the dry wind moving across the highway and the low rumble of passing vehicles in the distance. Turner glanced at Mercer. Something about Calvin's composure bothered him. Most people became angry. Some pleaded. Others panicked. Calvin did none of those things. He simply stood there as if he already knew how this encounter would end. Mercer stepped toward Calvin's vehicle and reached for the black briefcase. "What's in the case?" he demanded. Calvin looked directly at him. Then, for the first time, a faint warning entered his voice. "Officer Mercer, I strongly suggest you don't open it." Mercer smiled. "Now I really want to know what's inside." His hand moved toward the latch. Calvin said nothing, because he knew something the two officers didn't. They hadn't just stopped the wrong black man 3 miles from Area 51. They had just stepped into a federal operation that was already watching them. The story had begun less than 20 minutes earlier, when Calvin Morgan turned off the main highway and followed a narrow service road through the bare Nevada landscape. It was a little after 11 in the morning, and the desert sun had already turned the air above the pavement into shimmering waves. In the distance, the mountains stood like dark walls against an endless blue sky. 3 miles away, beyond layers of restricted fencing and warning signs, lay the perimeter of Area 51. Calvin had been instructed to deliver a sealed federal package to a secure meeting point before noon. The documents inside his black briefcase were not ordinary government papers. They contained information connected to a sensitive federal investigation, and Calvin had personally taken responsibility for transporting them. He had deliberately traveled without an escort. No flashing lights, no government convoy, no visible security detail. The less attention he attracted, the better. That decision had seemed reasonable when he left Las Vegas that morning. Now, standing beside a patrol car with his wrists locked behind his back, it felt like the one decision that had placed everything at risk. Officer Wade Mercer walked around the front of Calvin's SUV, inspecting it with exaggerated suspicion. "You said you're heading toward the restricted zone," Mercer said. "That's not what I said," Calvin replied. "I said I have authorization to be in this area." Mercer stopped and turned. "Authorization from who?" Calvin paused. "A federal agency." Mercer gave a short laugh. "That's convenient." Officer Blake Turner remained several feet away, watching the exchange. He seemed less confident than his partner, but he said nothing. Calvin noticed that. He also noticed the body camera attached to Turner's uniform. The small red indicator was blinking. Good, Calvin thought. At least one record would exist. Mercer stepped closer. Show me the authorization. Calvin nodded toward the briefcase. It's inside. Then open it. I can't. Mercer frowned. Can't or won't. Neither. I'm not authorized to open those materials in front of you. Mercer stared at him for several seconds. You expect me to believe that? Calvin met his eyes. I don't expect you to believe anything. I expect you to follow procedure. That sentence changed the atmosphere. Mercer clearly didn't like being instructed by a man he believed was just another driver. He reached for the briefcase again. Turner finally spoke. Wade, maybe we should call the station. Mercer looked at him sharply. You want to explain to the sergeant that we let a suspicious man walk away near a restricted facility? Turner fell silent. Calvin watched them carefully. He wasn't angry. Not yet. He was measuring every word, every movement, every decision. Because the longer Mercer continued, the more evidence he created. Then Mercer picked up the briefcase and placed it on the hood of the patrol car. We're going to find out exactly who you are, he said. Calvin looked at the case, then at the officer. Officer Mercer, he said quietly, already had the opportunity to find out. Mercer smiled. And now I'm taking it. Mercer lifted the black briefcase from the hood of the patrol car and held it as though he had just discovered evidence of crime. The bright Nevada sun reflected off its metal clasp, while Calvin stood several feet away with his hands cuffed behind him. For a moment, neither man spoke. Officer Blake Turner glanced toward Calvin, then at the briefcase. Wade, there's no reason to open federal property without confirming the authorization. Mercer ignored him. You keep defending this guy, he said. Do you know him? Turner shook his head. No, then stop acting like his lawyer. Calvin listened quietly. He could hear the faint hum of traffic beyond the checkpoint, the dry wind brushing against the roadside signs, and the occasional crackle of a radio. Everything around him looked ordinary. That was the strange part. The sky was perfectly blue. The desert was completely exposed. There were no shadows deep enough to hide anything. Yet somehow, in the middle of all that daylight, Calvin felt as though he were standing inside a room where nobody wanted to see the truth. Mercer opened the briefcase halfway before stopping. What's your position? He asked. Calvin answered carefully. That's not relevant to your stop. Mercer narrowed his eyes. It becomes relevant when you're carrying sealed documents 3 miles from a restricted federal facility. Calvin looked at him. Then verify my authorization through the proper channel. Mercer shook his head. You keep saying that word. Authorization. You expect me to believe a man driving alone in a denim shirt has federal clearance. Turner looked away. The comment made him uncomfortable. Calvin didn't react, but his eyes remained fixed on Mercer. He had spent decades learning that power was often revealed not by what people said, but by what they assumed they could do. Mercer walked closer. Who do you work for? Calvin paused. The federal government. Which agency? I can't discuss that here. Mercer laughed again. Of course you can't. He looked toward Turner. See what I mean? Turner hesitated. Maybe we should just run his information. We already did, Mercer replied. Nothing came back. Calvin immediately understood what that meant. Mercer had checked the identity information available to a local officer, but he had not requested the federal verification that would have settled everything. You haven't completed the verification, Calvin said. Mercer turned sharply. You don't tell me what I've completed. I'm not telling you, Calvin replied. I'm explaining what you haven't done. The words were calm, but they landed harder than an argument. Mercer stepped closer until he was standing directly in front of Calvin. You think you're smarter than me? Calvin looked into his eyes. No, a pause. I think you're making a decision before you have all the facts. Turner lowered his gaze. For the first time, he seemed to realize that something about this stop was wrong. But Mercer had already made up his mind. He tightened his grip on the briefcase and said, We're taking you in until we figure out exactly who you are. Calvin slowly exhaled. The handcuffs remained cold around his wrists. He looked toward the open desert, then back at the two officers. All right, he said quietly. Let's see how far you take this. Calvin barely moved as Officer Wade Mercer opened the rear door of the patrol vehicle. The bright Nevada sun beat down on the asphalt, and the heat rising from the road made the distant mountains appear to shimmer. Officer Blake Turner stood beside the driver's door, watching in silence as Mercer motioned toward the back seat. "Get in." Calvin looked at him. "Am I under arrest?" Mercer hesitated for half a second. "You're being detained." "For what?" "We already discussed that." "No," Calvin said calmly. "You haven't given me a specific reason." Mercer's jaw tightened. "Don't make this harder than it has to be." Calvin glanced at Turner. "Officer Turner, please document that I asked for the legal basis of this detention." Turner looked uncomfortable. "Wade," Mercer cut him off. "Just get him in the car." Calvin didn't resist. He turned slowly and began walking toward the patrol vehicle. Then Mercer grabbed his arm and pulled him around. The movement was abrupt enough to make Turner step forward. "Wade, easy." Mercer ignored him. "Hands behind your back." Calvin's wrists were already cuffed. "They're already secured." Against the car. Calvin obeyed. His palms touched the warm metal of the patrol vehicle. The desert wind moved through his blue denim shirt as Mercer searched him again. Calvin remained still. No shouting. No struggle. No attempt to intimidate the officers. That calmness seemed to irritate Mercer more than resistance would have. "You think you're above this?" Mercer asked. Calvin answered without turning. "No." "Then why do you keep acting like you know better?" "Because I know you haven't verified my identity." Mercer stepped closer. "Maybe I don't need to." Turner finally looked directly at him. "Wade, we should call the station." Mercer turned. "You want to take responsibility if this guy disappears?" Turner said nothing. Mercer reached for Calvin's wallet and pulled out another identification card. He examined it briefly, then frowned. The card contained a federal seal and a name that matched the driver's license. But there was no obvious job title printed across the front. Mercer held it up. "This isn't enough," Calvin quietly said, "then make the call." Mercer shoved the card back into the wallet. "You're going in." Calvin looked toward the briefcase still sitting on the hood of the patrol car. "And the documents?" "Those are coming with us." For the first time, Calvin's expression changed. Not fear, concern. "Officer Mercer, those documents are federally protected." Mercer smiled. "Then you should have thought about that before driving out here." Turner looked at the briefcase again. "Maybe we really should wait for a supervisor." Mercer shook his head. "We're past that." He opened the patrol car door. Calvin paused before getting inside. He looked at Turner and said quietly, "Officer, remember this moment." Turner frowned. "Why?" Calvin held his gaze. "Because when this is over, someone is going to ask you what happened here." Then Calvin lowered himself into the back seat. The door slammed shut. Outside, Mercer picked up the black briefcase. And as he carried it toward the front of the vehicle, he still had no idea that the man he had just locked in the back seat was the director of the FBI. Inside the patrol vehicle, Calvin sat quietly with his cuffed hands resting behind him as the engine started. Through the window, he watched the desert checkpoint slowly disappear behind them. The sun remained high above the Nevada landscape, bright enough to expose every detail of the empty road. Yet Calvin felt a growing weight in his chest, not because he was afraid. He was worried about the briefcase. Those documents had been sealed under federal authority for a reason. If the wrong person opened them, the consequences could extend far beyond this roadside stop. Up front, Officer Wade Mercer placed the black briefcase on the passenger side floor. Officer Blake Turner took the driver's seat. "Where are we taking him?" Turner asked. "Station," Mercer replied. "We'll figure out the rest there." Turner glanced into the rearview mirror. Calvin's eyes met his for a moment. "Wade, should we call the supervisor now?" Mercer shook his head. "No, why not?" "Because we don't need someone second-guessing us before we know what we've got." Calvin listened carefully. There was again. They weren't trying to determine what had happened. They were trying to justify what they had already decided. Turner hesitated before starting the vehicle. Calvin finally spoke. "Officer Turner." Turner looked at him in the mirror. "Yes. You should make the call." Mercer turned around sharply. "I told you to stop giving orders." Calvin ignored him. "I'm not giving orders. I'm asking him to verify my identity through the appropriate federal channel." Mercer laughed. "You really think that will scare us?" Calvin looked at him calmly. No, it might save you. The patrol car became silent. Turner slowly reached for the radio. Mercer stopped him. Don't. Turner froze. Wait, I said don't. Calvin lowered his eyes. That moment mattered. Not because Turner had almost made the call, but because Mercer had deliberately prevented it. Every second was becoming another piece of evidence. Then Calvin shifted slightly in the back seat and reached toward his jacket pocket. Mercer immediately reacted. What are you doing? My phone. Leave it. I need to make a call. Mercer turned fully around. You're not making any calls. Calvin stared at him. You have no legal reason to prevent me from contacting my office. Mercer scoffed. Your office? Calvin said nothing. Mercer reached back and took Calvin's phone from his pocket. He looked at the screen. Several missed calls were already appearing. One name caught his attention. Marcus Reed. Mercer frowned. Who's Marcus Reed? Calvin answered quietly. Someone you should have spoken to 20 minutes ago. Mercer shook his head and locked the phone. Not happening. He placed it on the dashboard. Turner looked at the name again. Something about it bothered him. He had heard that name before, but he couldn't remember where. Then the phone began ringing. Once, twice, 3 times. The screen lit up again. Marcus Reed. Turner looked at Mercer. Mercer stared at the phone. For several seconds, nobody moved. Then Calvin quietly said, That's your last opportunity to make the right call. Mercer reached over and rejected the call. The screen went dark. Calvin closed his eyes for a moment. Not in defeat, in resignation, because now there was no doubt. The officers had been given multiple chances to verify who he was. They had refused every one of them. And somewhere beyond the desert, people were already beginning to realize that Calvin Morgan was missing. The patrol vehicle moved deeper into the desert, leaving the checkpoint farther behind with every mile. Outside the windows, the Nevada landscape stretched endlessly beneath the hard afternoon sun. But inside the vehicle, the silence had become heavier. Calvin Morgan sat in the back seat, his wrists still cuffed, his blue denim shirt slightly wrinkled from the restraint. He watched the road through the window without saying a word. In the front, Officer Wade Mercer kept one hand near the black briefcase while Officer Blake Turner drove. Turner glanced at it again. We should not be carrying that, he said quietly. Mercer looked at him. It's evidence. Evidence of what? Turner asked. Mercer didn't answer immediately. Suspicious activity. Turner frowned. We haven't established a crime. Mercer tightened his jaw. We'll establish it when we get to the station. Calvin heard every word. He could have corrected them. He could have told them that the case contained federal materials that should never have left his custody. But he knew the moment had already moved beyond a simple misunderstanding. Now, there was a decision to make. If he revealed his identity too soon, they might stop call their supervisor and claim it was all a misunderstanding. But if he remained silent, every additional decision they made would reveal something much more serious. Mercer suddenly placed the briefcase on his lap. Let's see what we've got. Turner immediately looked over. Wait, don't open that. Why? Because he told us it's protected. Mercer scoffed. A man we're detaining doesn't get to decide what we inspect. His fingers moved toward the metal clasp. Calvin finally spoke. Officer Mercer. Mercer glanced backward. What? That case is under federal seal. You already said that. And I'm telling you again. Mercer smiled coldly. You really expect me to believe you? Calvin held his gaze. No, I expect you to understand the consequences of opening it. For the first time, Mercer hesitated. But pride quickly replaced caution. He flipped the first latch. Turner looked increasingly uncomfortable. Wade, seriously. Relax. The second latch opened. Mercer lifted the lid slightly. Inside were several sealed folders, each marked with official federal classification warnings. He froze for half a second. Then he saw Calvin's name printed on one of the documents. Calvin Morgan. Mercer stared at it. That's your name. Calvin said nothing. Turner glanced at the folder. Why would your name be on federal documents? Mercer quickly closed the case. Doesn't matter. Turner looked at him. It matters a lot. Mercer placed the briefcase back on the floor. We're taking it in. Calvin watched him through the reflection in the window. He could see the uncertainty beginning to grow in Turner's face. But Mercer still refused to stop. Then the patrol radio crackled. Unit 17, respond. Turner reached for the radio. A dispatcher continued. Possible federal security concern reported near the restricted perimeter. All units maintain position and await instructions. Turner looked at Mercer. The color seemed to drain slightly from his face. Wade. Mercer stared forward. Calvin lowered his eyes. Somewhere, someone had finally realized exactly who was missing. The question was no longer whether Calvin Morgan would be identified. The question was how long Mercer could continue pretending he had made the right decision. The patrol vehicle had barely traveled another mile when Officer Blake Turner saw something in the rearview mirror. At first, it looked like dust rising from the desert road. Then the shape became clearer. One black SUV appeared over the ridge. Then another. Then a third. They were moving quickly but without sirens, without flashing lights, and without the chaotic urgency of ordinary police vehicles. Turner tightened his grip on the steering wheel. Wade, he said quietly. Officer Wade Mercer looked through the windshield. What? Turner pointed toward the road behind them. Those vehicles. Mercer turned his head. The confidence in his face disappeared for the first time. The three SUVs were closing the distance. Calvin Morgan watched them approach through the rear window. He said nothing. He didn't need to. The moment had arrived. Turner slowed the patrol car. Mercer reached for the radio. Unit 17, identify those vehicles. Static answered first. Then a voice came through. All units, hold position. Federal personnel are approaching. Turner looked at Mercer. Federal personnel? Mercer didn't answer. He stared at Calvin through the rearview mirror. Calvin's expression remained calm. The first SUV stopped behind them. Two men in dark suits stepped out. Then the second vehicle stopped. More agents followed. No one shouted. No one raised a weapon. They simply moved with the quiet confidence of people who already knew exactly what they were looking for. One man walked toward the patrol car. Turner rolled down the window. Can I help you? The man looked past him toward the back seat. Where is Calvin Morgan? Mercer immediately responded, he's being detained. The man stared at him. I asked where Calvin Morgan is. Turner slowly pointed toward the back seat. The man walked closer. His eyes met Calvin's through the glass. Then he stopped. Director Morgan? Calvin gave a small nod. The man's expression tightened. He turned toward the two officers. You need to remove those cuffs immediately. Mercer stepped out of the vehicle. Before we do anything, I'd like to know who you are. The man reached inside his jacket and displayed his credentials. Marcus Reed, Deputy Director, Federal Bureau of Investigation. Silence fell over the roadside. Turner looked at Calvin, then at Mercer. Mercer stood completely still. Marcus looked toward the black briefcase. Where are the documents? Mercer pointed toward the passenger floor. Marcus's expression changed. You opened that case? Mercer hesitated. I inspected it. Marcus stared at him. That case was under federal seal. Turner immediately looked down. I told him not to. Marcus turned back toward the patrol car. Director Morgan, are you injured? Calvin shook his head. No, Marcus nadie. Good. Then he looked directly at Mercer. Officer, do you understand who you've detained? Mercer swallowed. For several seconds, he couldn't answer. Calvin finally spoke from the back seat. You should have made that call when I asked. Marcus stepped closer. He's right. Turner slowly removed the handcuffs. As the metal clicked open, Calvin rubbed his wrists and stepped out into the bright Nevada sunlight. He didn't look angry. He didn't celebrate. He simply looked at Mercer and said, this could have ended very differently. Mercer stared at him, unable to speak. Then Marcus delivered the sentence that changed everything. Officer Mercer, this is no longer a traffic stop. He paused. It's now a federal investigation. The desert seemed quieter after the handcuffs came off. Calvin Morgan stood beside the patrol vehicle, adjusting the sleeves of his blue denim shirt while Marcus Reed spoke with the federal agents a few yards away. Officer Blake Turner remained frozen near the driver's door, his face showing the weight of what had just happened. Officer Wade Mercer, however, was still trying to hold on to the confidence that had carried him through the entire encounter. There has to be some misunderstanding, Mercer said. Marcus turned toward him. There is no misunderstanding. Mercer pointed toward Calvin. He never told us who he was. Calvin looked at him calmly. I asked you to verify my identity. You refused to cooperate, Mercer replied. Marcus stepped forward. He gave you identification. He asked you to contact your supervisor. He asked you to verify his credentials. You refused every opportunity. Mercer glanced at Turner. Blake, tell him. Turner lowered his eyes. He's right. Mercer stared at his partner. What? Turner swallowed. He asked us to make the call several times. The words hung in the hot desert air. Marcus nodded toward another federal agent, who approached carrying a tablet. We have the body camera recordings. Mercer's face tightened. Recordings of what? Everything. The agent turned the screen toward Marcus. The footage showed the initial stop, the questions, the handcuffs, the repeated request to verify Calvin's identity, and Mercer's refusal to make the call. Then came the moment Mercer took Calvin's phone and rejected the incoming call from Marcus. Mercer looked away. That doesn't prove anything. Marcus replied. It proves exactly what happened. He then looked toward the black briefcase. And there's another problem. The federal agent opened a digital record. The briefcase was sealed under federal authority before Director Morgan left Las Vegas. Turner looked at Mercer. You opened it. Mercer immediately said, I didn't remove anything. Calvin finally spoke. That isn't the standard. Mercer turned toward him. You think because you're the FBI director, you can destroy my career? Calvin shook his head. No, your decisions will determine that. The sentence silenced everyone. Marcus walked closer to Calvin. Director, we need to secure the documents and take your statement. Calvin nodded. Before leaving, he looked at Turner. Officer Turner, did you know the documents were sealed? Turner hesitated. Yes. And did you tell Officer Mercer not to open them? Yes, sir. Calvin nodded once. He wasn't trying to humiliate him. He was establishing the truth. Marcus then turned to Mercer. Officer Mercer, your badge is not being taken today because of who you detained. Mercer looked up. Then why? Marcus answered without hesitation. Because of what you did after you had multiple opportunities to stop. Mercer stood silent. For the first time that day, his badge no longer looked like a symbol of authority. It looked like evidence. Within hours, an internal investigation would begin. Within days, both officers would be placed on administrative leave. And before the week was over, the decision they had made on a bright Nevada morning would follow them far beyond that desert road. 3 days later, the same desert road looked almost exactly as it had that morning. The sky was clear. The mountains stood silently in the distance. Cars passed along the highway without knowing that one of the most consequential federal investigations of the month had begun just a few miles away. Inside a federal conference room, Calvin Morgan sat at the end of a long table while Marcus Reed placed the final report in front of him. The investigation had confirmed what the body camera footage already showed. Officer Wade Mercer had ignored repeated requests for verification, unlawfully detained Calvin, interfered with his communication, and opened a federally sealed briefcase without authorization. Officer Blake Turner had participated in the detention, but his recorded objections and cooperation with investigators had been taken into account. The consequences came quickly. Mercer was terminated from the department. Turner was also removed from duty after an administrative review determined that he had failed to take sufficient action to stop the unlawful detention, though his cooperation remained part of the official record. Calvin read the report in silence. There was no satisfaction on his face, no ismite, no desire to humiliate either man. Marcus watched him carefully. You got what you wanted, he said. Calvin looked up. I didn't want them fired. Marcus raised an eyebrow. Then what did you want? Calvin closed the report. I wanted them to understand that authority has limits. For a moment, the room was silent. Calvin thought back to the roadside. The handcuffs. The briefcase. Mercer's refusal to make a phone call. Turner's hesitation. Every moment had seemed small when it happened. But together, they had revealed something much larger. Marcus leaned back. The department is using the incident for new training protocols. Calvin nodded. Good. And the case is being reviewed for possible additional violations. Calvin stood and walked toward the window. Outside, the city moved as usual. People hurried to meetings. Cars stopped at intersections. Officers continued their shifts. Most would never know what had happened in the Nevada desert. But Calvin knew one lesson had been made clear. A badge could open doors. It could command attention. It could give an officer the authority to stop a vehicle or question a stranger. But a badge could never give someone the right to decide another person's worth. Calvin looked down at his blue denim shirt, the same shirt he had worn when Mercer first decided he was suspicious. He remembered the officer's words, "You don't look like you belong here." Calvin quietly shook his head. He hadn't needed to belong to that checkpoint. He had belonged exactly where the law had authorized him to be. Before leaving the room, Marcus asked, "Do you think Mercer will ever understand what happened?" Calvin paused at the door. "I hope he does." Marcus waited. Calvin turned back. Because the real lesson isn't that he stopped the FBI director. He looked directly at Marcus. It's that he would have treated anyone the same way if no one had been watching. Then Calvin walked away. And somewhere in Nevada, the road where two officers had believed they controlled the situation remained silent beneath the afternoon sun. They thought they had stopped a stranger. They had actually exposed themselves. They thought the badge made them untouchable. But justice had never belonged to the badge. It belonged to the truth. And the truth had been watching. He thought he was enforcing the law. That day, the law was watching him. Please like and subscribe to the channel to hear more stories of justice.